After the birth, my wife thought I had gone out to buy coffee, but I saw the doctor holding her hand in a strange way. "Is the plan to get his inheritance still on?" she asked. The doctor replied, "I just need him to sign the papers." I was behind the curtain recording everything. The baby was not mine. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. My name is Rodrigo Salcedo Mina. I'm 52 years old. I've been working as a tax auditor at the Vito Lead Tax Agency for over 2 decades, and until Tuesday, October 7th, 2014, I thought I knew every inch of the life I had built. I knew it, as one knows, a balance sheet that's been reviewed for years. Every column in its place, every figure justified, every entry with its documented origin. I was a man who didn't leave loose ends at work or in life. I was wrong about everything. That morning began like any other in recent weeks. Amparo, with her contractions counted in a small notebook she carried in her nightgown pocket. The backpack for 10 days by the bedroom door, and me driving to the Rio Ortega University Hospital with that strange mix of fear and pride that only a man who is about to become a father for the first time at 52 understands. Yes, first time. We had been trying for 23 years, failing, trying again, until the doctors started using words you don't want to hear in a consultation with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs. And then, in a way that I still find hard to explain with the rationality that has defined me all my life, the pregnancy came at 44 years old for Amparo Villanueva Cross with a fertility specialist named Gustavo Pinado Ruiz. I should have seen what was right in front of my eyes from the beginning, but at that moment I saw nothing. I only saw my wife, the woman with whom I had shared a bed, a table, and silences for exactly 23 years, 3 months and 16 days, walking down the obstetric emergency hallway, with that expression of pain and determination I had never seen on her before. And I saw Dr. Pinado waiting for us by the delivery room door, as if it were completely natural, as if having attended her for 9 months in private consultations that I almost never accompanied her to, because work always had something urgent, had given him an unspoken right to be there at that moment. The delivery lasted 4 hours and 22 minutes. I was by her side almost the whole time. I held her left hand. I listened to Dr. Pinado give instructions with that calm, professional voice that I had always found reassuring. I wondered if I was going to faint because I was never one to handle hospitals and the atmosphere of clinical rooms well. And then I wondered if that would make me a bad father, even before being one. I thought of my own father, of how he wasn't present when I was born either, because in those days men waited in the hallway smoking. And I told myself that at least I was in there holding a hand that I believed needed me. Then Amparo said she needed cold water, not from a nurse. Me, that I should go get it for her. I went out into the hallway, walked to the beverage cart that was at the end of the corridor next to the coffee machine, and there I stopped. I don't know for sure why I stopped at that specific point, but in 22 years as a tax auditor, I've learned that instinct isn't magic or superstition. It's the silent accumulation of data that the brain processes long before you're aware of processing it. Something stopped me next to that gray plastic machine with the glass of cold water in my hand and made me turn slowly to look towards the delivery room. The door wasn't completely closed. I went back, not towards a room, but to the side of the hallway, where a dividing curtain hung between 2 recovery spaces. I positioned myself behind it without making a sound. I took the phone out of my pants pocket. I pressed the record button without fully knowing why I was doing it, as if another part of me, the part that had been adding up small details that didn't quite fit for months, already knew exactly what it was about to find. I kept completely silent and listened. Amparo had just given birth less than 4 minutes ago. The baby was being attended to in the warming cradle by the nurse, and at that moment, with the room still smelling of antiseptic and the heart monitor emitting its regular, indifferent beeps, my wife took Gustavo Pinado's hand, in a way no patient takes their doctor's hand, and asked him in a low voice, with that voice I knew from our private late-night conversations, if the plan was still on. The doctor replied that yes, they just needed me to sign the baby's registration, that with the child's name registered under my surname, the inheritance rights were guaranteed, without anyone being able to question them. That no one was going to suspect anything, because I wasn't the type of man who suspects. The phone didn't tremble in my hand. That surprised me then, and it still surprises me now when I remember it. What I did notice was that my eyes stopped looking at the curtain and fixed on an absurd and irrelevant point, a yellowish stain on the baseboard of the wall, right at floor level, with a shape vaguely resembling the outline of a map. I stared at that stain for what must have been about 10 or 12 seconds while my brain tried to organize what my ears had just registered. The sound of street traffic came muffled through the glass. Someone in the outer hallway was pushing a gurney with wheels that squeaked with every joint in the floor. The heart monitor kept beeping, completely oblivious to everything that had just been broken. I breathed slowly, turned off the recording, went back to the hallway walking normally, entered the nearest bathroom, locked it, and looked at myself in the mirror for a full minute without fully recognizing myself. I splashed cold water on my face twice. I dried it with a paper towel and returned to the delivery room with a glass of water for Amparo, as if I hadn't heard anything, as if the ground hadn't opened up under my feet in a hospital hallway on a Tuesday in October. She smiled at me when I entered. That smile that I had believed for 23 years was only mine. That night, when Amparo was resting with the baby in her arms and the room was silent, I put the phone inside a technical book on tax auditing that I had brought in my bag between the central pages of the chapter on documentary fraud. It was the only place in that room where no one would ever look for it. Amparo had never opened a technical book in her life. Weeks later, that book would become the piece that would destroy everything. But that night, standing by the hospital window, looking at the lights of Valladolid without really seeing them, I only asked myself one question that I couldn't answer. How long had I been building a life inside a lie? I still didn't know how many layers that betrayal had, and every week that passed revealed something worse. To understand what happened in that hospital, you first have to understand the kind of man I am. Not the man I became after all this, but the one I was for decades before any of it happened. Because betrayal doesn't fall into a vacuum. It falls on something concrete, on accumulated years, on a way of seeing the world that is built slowly, and that when it fractures, it does so with a noise that only the one who lived it from the inside can hear. I was born in Valladolid in 1962, the second of 3 children of a bank employee and a primary school teacher who sewed school uniforms at night to make ends meet. I grew up in a small apartment in the Rondilla neighborhood, in a building where the elevator had been broken since before I was born and where summers smelled of esparto grass and tomatoes roasting on the balconies. My father came home at 8, sat at the table, ate in silence, and the next day he would repeat it all over again. He was a man who didn't talk much, but who was always there. That's what I understood then by being a father, always being there, even if you didn't say anything. I studied economics at the University of Valladolid with a scholarship, year after year with visible pride. At that time, notes were taken by hand, libraries closed at 9 at night, and you had just enough money for the week. I finished my degree in 1985 at 22 with a certainty that no one had taught me, but that I had built on my own, that the only honest way to get ahead was to work harder than the person next to you and not ask anyone for anything. I took the civil service exams for the tax agency in 1988. I passed on the second attempt, and I haven't worked anywhere else since. I met Amparo Villanueva Cross at a college friend's wedding in the spring of 1990. She was 28, studying to be a teacher, and had this way of laughing out of turn when the humor of something had already passed for everyone else, which to me seemed the most genuine thing I'd seen in a long time. We started dating 3 months later. We got married in June of 1991 at the Church of San Miguel with 104 guests and a honeymoon in Asturias because that's what we could afford. There was no trip abroad or 5-star hotel. There was a light rain in Lanez, a seafood restaurant where Amparo ordered spider crabs for the first time in her life, and I paid with the last bills from the account we had opened that same week. I kept the receipt from that dinner for years in my wallet without knowing quite why. I suppose it was my way of keeping evidence, even of the good things. The first years of our marriage were austere and quiet, in a way that I now recognize as a form of happiness that I didn't know how to name at the time. We lived in a rented apartment on Calle Duque de la Victoria. We saved methodically, and on Sundays we had churros for breakfast and read the newspaper before going for a walk along the Pisuerga River. When we bought our own apartment in 1997, Amparo cried on the threshold before entering. I never asked her exactly why she was crying. I assumed it was out of joy and didn't insist. That was one of my many omissions of those years, assuming instead of asking, taking for granted instead of saying it out loud. I worked a lot, too much if I'm being completely honest from where I stand now. The audits piled up, the files didn't wait, and I was the kind of civil servant who stays late, not because anyone demands it, but because I can't stand leaving a report unfinished. Amparo spent many nights alone in that apartment we had bought together. Dinners without company, weekends with my briefcase open on the dining room table. I interpreted it as responsibility towards the family I was supporting. Now I understand that it was also a form of abandonment, even if that was never my intention. Intention doesn't erase consequences. Children didn't come, not for lack of trying, but for reasons that doctors explained with technical terms that Amparo wrote down in a small blue-covered notebook, and I listened to without fully grasping. There were 3 attempts at in vitro fertilization between 2004 and 2009. 2 failed before 3 months. The 3rd made it to 16 weeks. That was the blow that neither of us talked about as it deserved to be talked about because I didn't know how to open up in that way, and Amparo closed the door inside herself after that winter that she never opened with me again. I should have looked for her behind that door. I didn't. Life continued with that silent resignation that is sometimes mistaken for stability. We had a good standard of living. We traveled once or twice a year. We spent summers in a rural house that we always rented in the same village in Zamora. She had left direct teaching and was managing a small tutoring academy in the neighborhood. I was still at the agency, promoted to head of unit since 2007. From the outside, anyone would have said we were a mature couple without any drama. Then, in the fall of 2012, Amparo told me she wanted to try one last time with a private specialist who had been recommended to her, a doctor named Gustavo Penado Ruiz, with a practice on Paseo de Zorrilla, 42 years old, trained in fertility in Barcelona. Very good references, according to her. I agreed without hesitation. I thought that if that was what she needed to finally close that chapter, it was worth a try. I accompanied her to the first few consultations. Penado seemed proper, professional, with that clinical distance that has always inspired confidence in me. But work piled up as usual, and Amparo started going alone with the naturalness of someone who doesn't want to bother. I interpreted it as the maturity of a woman who had already gone through too many medical procedures to need company at every visit. When she announced the pregnancy in January of 2013, we both cried in the kitchen at home with our coffee half drunk on the counter and the gray January light coming in through the window. It was biologically possible. The doctors confirmed it without hesitation. It was improbable, but not impossible. I clung to the possible because that's what men of my generation do when life gives them something they've been waiting for years. They don't ask too many questions about where it comes from. They just give thanks that it has arrived. That's exactly what I did, and it turned out to be the most expensive mistake of my entire life. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of the house in a way that I received as something completely natural. Amparo had waited so long for this that no one in their right mind would have reproached her for making it the center of her attention. The consultations multiplied. Books on late motherhood occupied the bedside table, and she developed this new habit of noting dates and observations in a brown leather agenda that she always kept in the bottom drawer of her desk. I watched all this with the discreet satisfaction of a man who feels he has finally fulfilled something that had been pending for years, even though, strictly speaking, the only thing I had done was be present when necessary and sign the private health insurance forms. The consultations with Gustavo Penado Ruiz were still almost always in solitude. At first, I interpreted it as a continuation of the dynamic that had already been established before the pregnancy. Amparo knew the corridors of that clinic on Paseo de Zorrilla better than I did. She knew the names of the nurses, she knew which counter to pick up the results from, and how long to wait if the doctor was running late. It was her medical territory, built over months of visits that I hadn't been able or hadn't wanted to accompany. It was logical that she would continue to move there with that autonomy that was her own. But there are things you register without realizing you're registering them. The first was in March of 2013, a Thursday. Amparo had gone for a routine checkup in the afternoon and came home around 8. Nothing out of the ordinary. She told me everything was fine, that Dr. Pinado was satisfied with the progress, that the weight was correct for that week of gestation. I sat next to her on the sofa, gave her a kiss on the temple, and at that moment I perceived a small detail that didn't quite fit. She smelled different. It wasn't her usual perfume, that floral cologne she'd worn since the early years of our marriage and that I associated without thinking with Saturday mornings at home. It was something more intense, more woody, with a note I didn't recognize and that didn't belong to any of the bottles on her dressing table. I didn't say anything. I told myself she had tried something new at a perfume shop, or that maybe a friend had offered her cologne when they met. That's the mechanics of self-deception. There's always a reasonable explanation available if you want to find it. The second was in May. We were finishing dinner when her phone rang. She picked it up normally, looked at the screen, and got up from the table with a gesture between casual and hurried to answer in the hallway. From the kitchen, I heard fragments, a low voice, monosyllables, a yes tomorrow, and then silence. When she came back, I asked her who it was. She told me it was Dr. Pinado's office, that they wanted to confirm the time of the next day's checkup. I accepted it without further ado. It was 11:23 at night, but private clinics sometimes had extended administrative shifts, or at least that's what I told myself. The third detail came in July during the week of the Feast of St. James. We had planned to have dinner with Jacinto Orellana Vega, my childhood friend, and his wife Dolores, at a restaurant on Calle Correos that we had all liked for years. Amparo canceled that same afternoon, 2 hours before the reservation, with a back pain she described as acute and unbearable. I stayed home with her. I called Jacinto to apologize, and we spent the night at home watching television. The back pain subsided around 10 with 2 painkillers, and she slept without any problem. 3 days later, Jacinto called me on my mobile as I was leaving an internal audit meeting. He asked me how Amparo was, if she had recovered. I told him yes, that it had been a passing thing. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, one of those pauses that aren't empty, but contain something the other person doesn't know whether to say. Then he spoke. He told me that on the night of the canceled dinner, leaving the restaurant with Dolores, he had seen Amparo on the terrace of a place 3 streets away. She was sitting across from a man of about 40, dark-haired, medium build, with a light-colored shirt. He couldn't identify him from where he was. I remained silent for a few seconds with the phone in my hand in the agency's parking lot, with the July sun beating down on the asphalt. Jacinto quickly added that maybe it was a family member, a cousin, a colleague from the academy, that he didn't want to create any misunderstanding, but that he was telling me because we had been friends since school and because it had seemed strange to him not to tell me. I thanked him for telling me and said goodbye normally. That afternoon, when I got home, I asked Amparo how she had spent the night we had had dinner with Jacinto. She told me she had slept most of the time, that the painkiller had left her dazed. She said it looking me directly in the eyes, with the serenity of someone telling a rehearsed truth or of someone who simply has no awareness of lying. I accepted her version. I filed what Jacinto had told me in that mental compartment where one keeps things that don't fit, but that one hasn't yet decided to examine. I kept working. I kept coming home late. I kept assuming that everything I didn't understand had an explanation I hadn't bothered to look for. In September, with the birth approaching, Amparo spent 2 weekends away from home, visiting her sister in Salamanca. Or so she told me. I stayed in Valladolid, reviewing backlog files, and thinking that when the baby was born, everything would change, that I would finally have a daily and concrete reason to close my briefcase before 9 at night. There's one last thing I registered in those months, and that at the time seemed completely innocent. One afternoon in October, 4 days before the birth, I entered the bedroom without making a sound because Amparo was resting and I didn't want to disturb her. On the bedside table, next to the glass of water and the iron tablets, was the open brown leather agenda. I didn't read it. It wasn't my style to go through her things, and besides, I had never felt the need to. But the open page had a single notation in the afternoon column, written in her small, tight handwriting, a name, a time, and an address that wasn't the clinic on Paseo de Zorilla. I closed the door carefully and didn't think any more about it. Now I know I should have thought a lot about it. But at that moment, I was a man who still believed that 23 years of marriage build a kind of loyalty that needs no verification, that the people you love don't lie premeditatedly for months. That the life you have built brick by brick has the solidity of what you yourself have put into it. That week, without knowing it yet, was the last of that way of believing. Tuesday, October 7th, 2014, dawned with fog over the Pisuerga River. I remember that with a precision I haven't been able to fully explain, because we humans don't usually retain the meteorological details of important days, unless something in the body decides to record them as the inevitable context of what's about to happen. The fog was low and dense, the kind that appears in Valladolid in October without warning and that turns the bridges into silhouettes without banks. I drove to the Rio Ortega University Hospital with the lights on at 7 in the morning and Amparo in the passenger seat, counting the interval between contractions out loud. We arrived at the obstetric emergency room at 7:42. The on-duty staff knew Amparo from her history. They attended to her with that calm efficiency of those who have seen enough births not to dramatize anything. Gustavo Penado appeared at 8:15 in a green gown and a stethoscope around his neck. He greeted Amparo with a familiarity that I then interpreted as that of a doctor who has managed a high-risk pregnancy for months and who feels the responsibility to be present at the final moment. He shook my hand too, firmly, briefly, professionally. The delivery was long, 4 hours and 22 minutes from admission to the final push. I was on the left side of the bed, holding Amparo's hand when she needed it and moving aside when the nurses required space. There were moments of technical tension that Penado resolved with precise instructions to the team, without raising his voice, without unnecessary gestures. I watched him work during those hours, and I found nothing in him that wasn't exactly what he should be doing. A doctor doing his job. Then, when there were perhaps 40 minutes left, Amparo said she needed cold water, not with anguish, but with that particular firmness that women develop in childbirth. A firmness that allows neither delays nor intermediaries. She wanted me to go. The beverage cart is at the end of the corridor, she told me, next to the coffee machine. I had seen it when we arrived. I went out into the hallway. I walked down the corridor with the dull noise of the hospital enveloping me. Steps on linoleum, the distant beep of some monitor, the murmur of a conversation between two orderlies as I turned the corner. I reached the coffee machine, which was indeed at the end, next to a metal cart with pitchers of water and stacked disposable cups. I took one, filled it, and then I stopped. It wasn't a thought. It was something before thought, something more primitive that operated below the levels where one makes conscious decisions. 22 years of auditing documents, reviewing records, looking for inconsistencies in columns of figures that at first glance seemed correct, had sharpened in me a kind of perception that I can't name with precision, but that I recognize when it appears. The feeling that something doesn't add up, even if I can't yet identify exactly what it is. I went back down the hallway, not towards the delivery room, but to the left side of the corridor, where a dividing curtain hung between two recovery spaces that were empty at that moment. I positioned myself behind it without making a sound. The delivery room door wasn't completely closed, just ajar, with a gap of about 8 centimeters that let both the interior light and the sound pass through. I took the phone out of my pants pocket, pressed the record button. What happened next lasted less than 2 minutes in real time, but there are experiences that the brain processes at a different speed than the clock. And those 2 minutes I have reconstructed so many times since then that each second now has the weight of something much longer. First I heard the baby, a brief, immediate, clean cry that lasted a few seconds before the nurse's hands attended to it. That sound reached me behind the curtain, and something in my chest opened up in a way I didn't expect, a physical and sudden emotion that I had to hold on to tightly, because it was neither the time nor the place to let it out. Then I heard Amparo's voice, exhausted and low, with that tone of someone who has just done something that has drained every last available resource. She said his name. Gustavo's name, not doctor, just the name. There was a silence of 3 or 4 seconds. Then she asked if the plan was still on. I remained completely still. The glass of water in my left hand, the phone in my right, my back against the cold wall of the corridor. My eyes stopped looking at the crack in the door and fixed with that absurd dissociation that true shot produces on a point on the baseboard opposite, a yellowish stain of irregular shape, with an outline vaguely resembling the profile of a peninsula right at floor level, where the white paint had given way to moisture. I stared at that stain for what must have been 10 or 12 seconds while my brain tried to do something with what my ears had just captured. The baby's heart monitor was emitting its regular, indifferent beeps. Outside on the street, the morning traffic came muffled through the glass of a nearby window. A bus braking, the engine of a delivery truck idling. Gustavo Penado's voice answered with a calmness that chilled me more than any shout. He said yes, that everything was still as planned, that there was only one step left, that they needed me to register the child, to sign the paternal recognition at the civil registry, that once the Salcedo surname was inscribed on the birth certificate, the child inheritance rights were legally guaranteed without anyone having reason to question them. He said with a naturalness that I still find difficult to assimilate, that I wasn't the type of man who raises suspicions about the things in front of him. Amparo replied something that I didn't quite hear, because her voice dropped to a murmur, but the tone was one of relief, the unmistakable tone of someone confirming that something complicated is about to be resolved. The phone didn't tremble in my hand. That surprised me at the time, and it still seems strange to me when I remember it. My body adopted a functional rigidity that I've seen in other people during situations of severe impact, and that in me manifested as a strange, almost technical concentration on the details of the immediate environment, the rough texture of the plastic cup between my fingers, the cold temperature of the water beginning to seep through the material, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the dry air of the hospital heating, the beep of the monitor, the stain on the baseboard. I turned off the recording, waited 20 seconds behind the curtain without moving, listening for more voices, more words. Only the ordinary noise of a medical room, closing a phase of work came. The rustle of latex gloves, the metallic sound of a tray, the voice of a nurse giving a routine instruction about the newborn's temperature. I entered the nearest bathroom, locked the door. I looked at myself in the mirror for about a minute without fully recognizing myself. Not in the dramatic sense of movies, but in the literal sense. The man the mirror reflected back was the same, as always, with the same blue shirt I had put on that morning, with the same wrinkles at the corners of my eyes that I've had since I was 45. But inside that man, something had just happened that hadn't yet found its place. I splashed water on my face, dried it, put the phone in the inside pocket of my jacket next to my chest. I went back to the room with a glass of water. Amparo looked up when I entered. She had the baby on her chest, wrapped in a green hospital blanket, with his eyes closed and his fists clenched, with that compact forcefulness of newborns. She looked at me with a slow, exhausted smile that I had been waiting to see for 23 years. I approached, gave her the water, looked at the child, and said nothing of what I knew because a tax auditor doesn't act with a single piece of evidence. A tax auditor builds the complete file before opening any proceedings, and what I had in the inside pocket of my jacket was just the beginning of a file that was still a long way from being closed. That night, I slept in the hospital, or more accurately, I was in the hospital during the night without sleeping at any point. I remained seated in the blue plastic chair that was next to Amparo's bed while she rested with the baby in the aluminum bassinet beside her. And I dedicated myself to the only thing I knew how to do when the situation surpassed any known frame of reference. Observe, record, maintain an outward composure, while inside I tried to organize something that resisted all classification. The baby slept with that absolute stillness of newborns, which sometimes scares those who don't know it. He was breathing. The monitors confirmed that everything was normal. A nurse came in twice during the night for routine checks, greeted in a low voice, left. Amparo slept almost without interruptions from 11 at night. I didn't take my eyes off the ceiling for hours with the phone inside the inner pocket of the jacket I had folded over the back of the chair, feeling its weight as if it had increased in density since I pressed the record button. At 6 in the morning on Wednesday, October 8th, when the gray light of dawn began to filter through the half-closed blind of the room, I got up carefully, took my jacket, and went out into the hallway without waking anyone. I went to the bathroom at the end of the corridor, washed my face, combed my hair with my fingers, looked at myself in the mirror for a few seconds, and decided that what I needed at that moment was air that didn't smell like a hospital. I told the on-duty nurse that I was going out for a moment to have breakfast, and that I would be back before Amparo woke up. I went down in the elevator, crossed the main lobby, pushed the glass door outwards. The October morning had that damp coldness that in Vito lead precedes the autumn sun, when the sky has not yet decided if it will clear completely. I pulled up the collar of my jacket and walked aimlessly for 2 blocks, then 3, until I found myself in front of my car parked on Ramon Hall Street, where I had left it the morning before everything changed. I got in, closed the door, rested my forehead on the steering wheel. I stayed like that for a time I can't precisely quantify. It could have been 10 minutes, or it could have been 40. What I know is that at no point did I cry, and that also surprised me, because it's not what you expect of yourself in a situation like that. What I felt was something different from crying, a kind of internal contraction, as if the body were closing doors one by one to prevent something from overflowing prematurely. I took the phone out of my pocket. I played the recording at a low volume, almost pressed to my ear. I listened to it from beginning to end. Then I rewound it and listened to it once more, this time paying attention not to the words, but to the nuances. Amparo's tone, Peynato's cadence, the absence of doubt in both voices. It wasn't an improvised conversation. It was the confirmation of something that had been agreed upon for a long time, with the terms already established and the steps already numbered. The inheritance, the registration, my surname as an instrument. I put the phone away again. A tax auditor learns very early on that the difference between a piece of evidence and a conclusive piece of evidence is the difference between winning and losing a case. An audio recording without documentary context can be questioned, relativized, taken out of its frame. A competent lawyer can argue that the audio is fragmented, that it was edited, that it lacks certified authenticity. I've seen solid cases fall apart in administrative proceedings for lack of sufficient documentary support. I wasn't going to make that mistake with the most important thing I had ever had in my professional and personal life. I needed to build the complete file. That meant not moving prematurely. It meant going back to the hospital, sitting by Amparo's bed, looking at the child, saying the things a father says in those circumstances, receiving the visits of acquaintances who would stop by in the following days, signing the discharge forms. Driving back home, taking the maternity bag inside, preparing the baby's room that we had set up in June. It meant continuing to be Rodrigo Salcedo Mina, tax auditor, husband of 23 years, first-time father at 52. Exactly the man Gustavo Penato had described as someone who doesn't raise suspicions about what's in front of him. That description, which he had pronounced as a compliment to his own plan, would become his worst miscalculation. Before starting the car, I made a decision about the phone. I couldn't have it in a drawer at home, or in the car, or in any place Amparo could reach by chance. I needed a place that met 2 simultaneous conditions: accessible to me at any time and completely invisible to her. The answer came on its own with that simplicity that solutions have when you stop forcing them. In the suitcase I had packed myself for the hospital admission, I had included, almost out of inertia, a copy of the Tax Audit Procedures Manual, revised 2009 edition. A 430-page book bound in a navy blue hardcover that had been a permanent part of my briefcase for years. Amparo had never opened a technical text in her life, neither out of curiosity nor by accident. That afternoon, back at the hospital with the coffee no one had asked me for, I put the phone between the central pages of the chapter on documentary fraud. I wrapped it in a folded sheet of paper so it wouldn't move. I closed the book, placed it in my briefcase with the other work papers. No one would look for it there. During the 4 days of postpartum admission, I acted with a normality that I don't know whether to call strength or dissociation. I received the acquaintances who came to see the baby. I accepted the congratulations with the appropriate expression. I answered the questions about the name we had chosen, about whether he looked more like one or the other about how I felt being a father for the first time. I was present at every moment with the methodical precision of a man who knows he is being watched and who cannot afford any gesture out of place. What no one saw was what happened at night when the room fell silent, and I sat in that blue plastic chair and dedicated myself to mentally reviewing everything he needed to gather before acting. The recording was the starting point, not the destination. I needed to know how long this had been going on. I needed to document Amparo's movements in the previous months. I needed to understand if there were financial implications beyond the baby's civil registration, because the reference to the inheritance in the recording was too specific to be a figure of speech, and above all, I needed to confirm what I already knew, but which without biological proof would remain just a personal certainty with no legal value. On Friday, October 10th, I signed a hospital discharge. I drove home with Amparo in the passenger seat and the baby in the approved rear-facing car seat we had installed in June. The sky over Valladolid was a clear, indifferent blue that in no way corresponded to what I was carrying inside. I took the maternity bag into the house, prepared the 3 o'clock bottle, started the washing machine, acted like the man I was supposed to seem to be, and I waited because patience isn't passivity. In 22 years of auditing, I learned that the time to intervene is never the first moment you have enough information to act, but the last moment you can do so without leaving any flank open. I hadn't reached that moment yet, but every day that passed brought me one step closer to it, and that was the only thing that allowed me to get up every morning and have breakfast across from Amparo as if the world were still the place she believed I inhabited. The first tool I used wasn't a detective or a lawyer. It was something I'd carried with me for over 2 decades, and that required no external hiring, my own analytical judgment. Before involving anyone else, before making any call that could leave a trail or raise any alarm, I sat for 3 consecutive nights at my desk at home while Amparo slept with the baby. I opened the bank statements for the last 3 years and reviewed them with the same systematic methodology I applied to tax fraud cases at the agency. An auditor doesn't look for the big anomalies first. The big anomalies are what anyone can see. What distinguishes an experienced auditor is the ability to detect the pattern within the small, the suspicious regularity hidden in the lines that no one looks at because they seem insignificant. In the statements of the joint account, I didn't find any striking transfers, no large charges with no apparent justification, but I found something more revealing than that, a series of cash withdrawals of €200 made with a periodicity of approximately 3 weeks, always on a Tuesday or Wednesday. Always at ATMs in the center of Valladolid, distributed over 26 months. In total, €6,800 withdrawn in cash gradually and silently, in amounts small enough not to trigger any domestic alerts, but regular enough to constitute an unequivocal pattern. €6,800 that didn't appear in any traceable expense of the domestic life I knew. I noted the dates, amounts, and ATMs in a notebook that I kept inside the same briefcase where the book with the phone was. Then I reviewed the receipts for the private health insurance we had taken out when the fertility consultations began. The policy covered follow-up visits and diagnostic procedures, but not complex assisted reproduction interventions. What I found upon reviewing the charges was that several of the co-payments corresponding to the last pregnancy checkups had been paid directly by Amparo in cash, without going through the insurance, on dates that didn't coincide with any of the appointments she had mentioned to me. Visits that didn't exist in the calendar I knew, hours that hadn't been spoken aloud. I put everything in the notebook, closed the briefcase. I went to bed. 3 days later, I called Jacinto Orlana Vega from the agency's landline during the lunch break and asked him to meet me for a drink. Jacinto is 54, has been working for 30 years as an industrial maintenance technician at an automotive components company in the San Cristobal Industrial Park, and is the only man I know who hasn't substantially changed since we were 12 years old in school. The same direct way of speaking, the same tendency to listen more than he talks, the same unconditional loyalty that is taken for granted in childhood and understood to be extraordinarily rare in adulthood. We met at a bar on Calle Calixto Fernandez de la Torre, which we'd frequented since the 90s. We ordered coffee. I explained the essentials without going into details he didn't need at that moment, that I had serious reasons to doubt the paternity of the baby and that I needed a biological test before moving in any direction. I asked him for a specific favor. When he went to visit the baby at home, as he had already done once since the discharge, I needed him to discreetly get a small biological sample. A swab rubbing the inside of the baby's cheek for a few seconds while he held him would be enough. I explained that private paternity tests were done with buccal samples and that the lab didn't require any identity documentation from the donor, just the labeled samples. Jacinto looked at me for a few seconds without saying anything. Then he nodded. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't ask if I had considered the consequences. He said he would stop by the house that week. He did so the following Thursday. He was at the house for 40 minutes. He had coffee with Amparo in the kitchen. He held the baby in his arms with that affectionate clumsiness that men who haven't raised their own children have. And when Amparo turned to the sink to rinse the cups, he did what I had asked him to do with a naturalness I couldn't have imitated. He handed me the swab in a sealed plastic bag when we crossed paths on the stair landing with the excuse that he had left his car keys in his jacket pocket. That same afternoon, I sent the samples by express courier to a private genetic analysis laboratory in Barcelona. I included a sample of my own obtained in the same way. The result would take between 10 and 14 business days. While I waited, I made the second decision I had pending to hire someone with investigative means I didn't possess. I looked for references through a colleague at the agency who had handled several fraud cases with the collaboration of private investigators, and I got the name of Esteban Muriel Cabrera. 48 years old, a private detective licensed by the Ministry of the Interior with an office on Calle Núñez de Arce in Valladolid. My colleague described him as meticulous, discreet, and with specific experience in cases combining marital infidelity with financial implications. Exactly the profile I needed. I met with Muriel on a Monday afternoon, with the work excuse of a coordination meeting at the tax agency office, which no one at home had a reason to verify. I gave him the initial data, approximate start dates of the consultations with Peinado, the pattern of cash withdrawals I had documented, the undeclared medical visits, and the audio recording from the hospital, of which I provided a copy on a USB drive that I had prepared specifically for that meeting. Muriel listened to the audio without interrupting me, took notes in a small black-covered notebook. When I finished, he explained the legal limits of his intervention, what kind of evidence he could obtain admissibly, and what would be outside of any legal process due to the way it had been collected. His fee was 1,000 euros per month plus documented expenses. I gave him a cash advance of 2,800 euros corresponding to the first 2 weeks, and asked him to start immediately. I returned home at dinner time. Amparo had made lentils. The baby was sleeping in the room. She asked me how my day had been, and I replied that it was good, that there was a complex audit in progress that would keep me busy for the next few weeks. It was true, though not in the way she understood. The most complex audit I had ever undertaken had her name on the file, and I was simultaneously the investigator and the main aggrieved party. We ate in relative silence with the television on in the background. Sometimes she would say something about the baby, about the 3 a.m. feeding, about whether the pediatrician had confirmed the correct weight at that week's checkup. I would respond, ask questions, nod, reach for the bread with the normality of someone with nothing to hide. That capacity for dissociation that I wouldn't have been able to name before those weeks. That ability to maintain 2 parallel realities without one filtering into the other was probably the only collateral benefit of decades spent reviewing others' frauds. I knew exactly what it felt like to be in front of someone who doesn't know they've been discovered. I knew it from the other side of the table. Now I knew it from this side too. And I still didn't know how much worse everything was going to get as soon as Muriel started delivering his first reports. The envelope from the laboratory arrived on a Tuesday morning, 14 days after it was sent, inside a plain white envelope with no visible letterhead, addressed to the tax agency, in the name of Rodrigo Salcedo Mina, as I had requested when placing the order. I picked it up from the department's incoming mail tray before anyone else arrived at the office at 8:15, with my coat still on and my briefcase in hand. I sat in my office, closed the door, and opened it with no apparent rush, as if it were just another audit report among those I managed every week. The result took up a page and a half. The vocabulary was technical and orderly, with percentages and allelic markers numbered in columns. I didn't need to read to the end to understand the conclusion. In the third paragraph of the report, in a language that left no room for any alternative interpretation, the laboratory certified a biological paternity compatibility of 0% between the sample identified as donor A and the sample identified as donor B. 0, not a low percentage. Not a figure that admitted technical doubt. 0. I folded the report carefully, put it inside a transparent plastic folder, and placed it in my briefcase next to the notebook of annotations and the tax audit book. Then I turned on the computer, opened the work file that I had been processing since the previous week, and spent 40 minutes reviewing amortization tables as if nothing had changed in the room. Not because nothing had changed, but because the confirmation of something I already knew with moral certainty doesn't produce the same kind of impact as the initial revelation. What it did produce, however, was a kind of definitive settling, like when the foundations of a building finish absorbing a new load and the ground stops moving. There was no longer any territory of doubt to take refuge in. The file was real. The task was to build it to the end. That same afternoon, I met with Esteban Muriel Cabrera at his office on Calle Núñez de Arce. He had been working on the case for 3 weeks and had notified me by a brief message that he had enough material for a first complete report. He received me with the characteristic sobriety of someone who has delivered news of this kind many times and has learned that the most respectful protocol is to go straight to the facts without wrappings that unnecessarily prolong the moment. On the table, he placed a navy blue cardboard folder with the case name written on an adhesive label. He opened it. The relationship between Amparo Villanueva and Gustavo Penado Ruiz had begun in July of 2012, 2 years and 3 months before the birth, coinciding exactly with the first private fertility consultations at the clinic on Paseo de Zorrilla. Muriel had documented 16 face-to-face meetings outside the clinical setting during that period, with verified dates, times, and locations. 3 different hotels in Valladolid, a temporary rental apartment in the Parque Sol neighborhood that Penado had leased in the name of a limited liability company with a tax domicile in Madrid, and 4 dinners and restaurants in the province of Salamanca. The July night, when Jacinto called me to tell me he had seen Amparo with a man on a terrace downtown, was listed in the report with the precision of time and establishment. I made a note in my notebook. I continued to listen. The second part of the report was where the air in the room changed temperature in a way that had nothing to do with the office heating. Muriel explained that during the investigation, he had detected a registration movement that didn't correspond to the usual dynamics of an ordinary marital infidelity. In June of 2014, 3 months before the birth, Amparo Villanueva had gone to a law firm in the center of Valladolid for a consultation on the marital economic regime, specifically on the legal distinction between community property and separate property in the event of separation or divorce, and on the inheritance rights of children recognized within the marriage versus assets acquired before the marriage. Muriel dropped that with the calmness of someone who knows the sentence needs no additional comment to produce its effect. That consultation wasn't that of a woman evaluating whether to leave a marriage. It was that of someone mapping the financial terrain before executing a specific step. The baby registered under my surname, as had been made clear in the hospital recording, wasn't just the product of a parallel relationship. It was the legal instrument of a strategy to access the assets I had been building for 3 decades. But it wasn't over. Muriel opened the second section of the folder and placed in front of me a copy of a document I recognized immediately by its format, a life insurance policy. Mine, I had taken it out in 2003 through the agency that handled my personal tax affairs as part of routine financial planning that at the time seemed to me as ordinary a task as renewing my car insurance. Sole beneficiary Amparo Villanueva Cross. Insured capital, 320,000 euros. There was nothing illegal about that. It was the usual in a childless marriage. What Muriel showed me next was something else. Among the investigation materials, the detective had obtained, by means he preferred not to detail in the written report the partial content of several conversations between Amparo and Peinado through a messaging application installed on her phone. Not the full text, which would have required methods outside the legal framework, but screenshots that Peinado had sent from his own device to an email address that Muriel had managed to associate with his name. In those screenshots appeared fragments of conversations where they both discussed with a normality that was more disturbing than any drama the division of the insurance policy capital in the event of my death in the coming years. Amparo calculated deadlines. Peinado mentioned the feasibility of waiting. There was a sentence from her written with the coldness of someone drafting a household budget that said that with the child registered and the policy in effect, the situation was covered enough to be patient. I read that sentence 3 times. The third time I didn't read it. I looked at it without processing the words, with my eyes fixed on the ink printed on the white paper, while somewhere below the level of formulated thoughts, something was happening that I can't describe with precision. It wasn't anger. Anger had already passed through me in the hospital like a train that doesn't stop at all stations. What I felt in front of that paper was something colder and more permanent. The definitive understanding that the person with whom I had had breakfast that morning, the person who had asked me to go down to buy bread because the baby had her exhausted, had been contemplating my death for months as a financial variable within a life plan that included another man. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then I asked Muriel if all the material was correctly documented regarding its origin and chain of custody in terms that would make it presentable to a legal advisor. He told me yes, that he had been careful on exactly that point from the beginning. I asked him to prepare an additional copy of the entire file in physical format and another in encrypted digital format. I paid the second monthly fee, went out into the street. It was late afternoon and Valladolid was turning on its streetlights with that automatic parsimony that cities have when it gets dark earlier than you remember. I walked to the car, sat inside. I didn't start it for a long time. I had believed until that afternoon that the hardest part of all this had been the night in the hospital. I was wrong. The hardest part was that specific moment behind the wheel, assimilating that the betrayal I had begun to investigate as a prolonged infidelity actually had a dimension I hadn't fully contemplated until that instant. They hadn't just planned to use that child to access what I had built. They had also contemplated a scenario in which I wouldn't be present to prevent it. But what happened next was no longer just a matter of personal dignity or marital justice. It was something that needed the backing of someone who knew every nook and cranny of Spanish legislation on family and property, and I needed that backing before taking any further steps. Consuelo Fraguas Nieto was 51, her office on the second floor of a building on Calle Ferrari, and a reputation in the Valladolid legal forum that needed no advertising because it had stood on its own for almost 20 years. I knew of her by reference through a colleague from the agency who had gone through a complicated separation process 3 years earlier and who had described her to me with a precision that turned out to be completely accurate, direct to the point of brusqueness. With no interest whatsoever in softening legal realities to make the first consultation more comfortable, and with an ability to read a file diagonally and extract weak points in less time than any other lawyer took to finish reading the cover. She received me on a Wednesday afternoon with no secretary in the waiting room, the door ajar, and 2 open folders on her desk, which she closed without taking her eyes off the document she was reading until she finished the paragraph. She pointed to the chair in front of her with a brief gesture. I sat down, placed my briefcase on my knees, and waited. When she looked up, I explained the case in chronological order and without embellishments. I gave her the folder with the lab report, Muriel's file, the notes on the cash withdrawals, and the copy of the insurance policy. She listened without interrupting me for 16 minutes, taking notes in a yellow legal pad with a black-capped fountain pen. When I finished speaking, she reviewed her own notes for a moment and then said 4 things in a row that interested me more than anything I had read about family law in the previous weeks. First, the challenge of marital paternity in Spain is a right of the husband that can be exercised at any time while the child is a minor, and with the DNA result I had, the procedure had a legally predictable outcome. Second, For the judicial resolution to be in the most favorable terms possible in financial matters, it was essential to accurately document which assets had been acquired before the marriage or with my own separate funds. Because in a parallel divorce proceeding, that distinction would make the difference between what was divisible and what was not. Third, the life insurance policy could be modified at any time by unilateral decision of the policyholder, which was me, without the need for prior communication to the beneficiary. Fourth, acting before Amparo knew that the file existed was the only way to eliminate the risk of preventive financial movements on her part. I asked her how long she needed to prepare the preliminary documentation for the challenge process. She told me 3 weeks if I provided her with all the financial documentation she needed. We agreed on a fee of €4,200 for the first phase of the procedure, with the possibility of extending the engagement depending on how the process evolved. I left Consuelo Fraguas' office with a list of documents I needed to gather, and with the first feeling in weeks that the ground under my feet was something firmer than sand. That same afternoon, I called the insurance company and changed the beneficiary of my life insurance policy. I gave a name of my sister Carmen, who lived in Burgos, and with whom I spoke on the phone every 2 or 3 weeks. I didn't explain the reason. I would tell her what was appropriate when the time came. During the following days, I dedicated myself to collecting the documents Consuelo needed. Deeds of properties acquired before the marriage, bank statements proving the origin of certain investments, records of inheritances received. It was meticulous work that I did at the agency's office, taking advantage of the hours when colleagues were in meetings or in the field, printing documents that I put directly into my briefcase without leaving a copy on the printer. It was during that week that everything almost fell apart. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had come home earlier than usual because a meeting had been canceled on short notice, and upon entering, I found Amparo in the bedroom, feeding the baby with the television on at a low volume. I left my briefcase in the hallway, as I always did, and went to the kitchen to drink water. When I returned to the bedroom to peek in for a moment, I noticed that the briefcase wasn't exactly where I'd left it. It was shifted about 20 centimeters to the right, with the clasp facing up instead of towards the wall, as was my habit. I felt a sharp drop in temperature in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold outside. I entered the bedroom normally. Amparo looked up from the baby and told me she had moved the briefcase accidentally while passing with the stroller. A logical explanation, completely plausible. But Amparo didn't use the stroller inside the apartment because the hallway was narrow and she always left it folded by the entrance. I knew at the moment she said it, and I filed it away without getting upset. I sat on the edge of the bed. I asked her how her day had been. I commented on something about the baby. The conversation flowed with its usual placidity, but before we turned off the light, while I was pretending to review a document on my phone, Amparo said something that forced me to physically control my body's response. She asked in a tone between casual and slightly inquisitive if there was any news with that bank account I had been seen talking about on the phone the previous week. She described it as the account you mentioned with someone from work. I don't know if it was something for the company or personal. I hadn't talked about any account on the phone at home the previous week, at least not where she could have heard me. I replied without looking up from my phone that it was a client's account under review. Nothing relevant, ordinary end of quarter paperwork. She nodded and didn't ask any more questions. She turned off the light on her side and turned towards the baby who was sleeping in the nearby crib. I remained awake for 2 hours with my eyes open in the dark. At 2 in the morning, I got up carefully, took my clothes for the next day and my briefcase, and left the bedroom. I changed in the hallway bathroom. I made a coffee that I didn't drink, and at 7:15, I left the house with the excuse of an early meeting that didn't exist. I drove to the agency, went up to my office, and locked the door from the inside. Then, for the first time since that night in the car in front of the hospital, something inside me gave way. It wasn't a cry that you remember clearly. It was something more physical than emotional, more like the release of a pressure that had been building up week after week without a release valve. I sat on the floor with my back against the side wall of the office, away from the window that overlooked the inner hallway, and I stayed like that for perhaps 10 minutes with my elbows on my knees and my face in my hands, not thinking about anything in particular. not formulating any questions or rehearsing any answers, just letting my body do what it had been repressing for weeks. What weighed most heavily on me at that moment wasn't the betrayal itself, nor the financial implications, nor the procedure I was preparing. It was a question that couldn't be answered with any file or any detective's report. If for 23 years, at some point I hadn't been able to identify, there had been something I could have done differently, not so that she wouldn't have made her own decisions, because that was her exclusive responsibility, but so as not to end up at 52 sitting on the floor of my own office, not knowing very well who had been living by my side all that time. I didn't find an answer. I didn't expect to either. I got up, went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water until the color returned to normal. I tied my tie properly in front of the mirror and went back to my desk. I took out my briefcase. I checked that everything was in its place, the audit book with the phone between its pages, the notebook with the annotations, the folder with Consuelo's documents. I turned on the computer and continued to work because what had happened on the floor of that office didn't change anything about what had to be done. It only confirmed that I had to finish it before the effort of sustaining that double reality cost me something I could no longer recover. The question was no longer whether to act, but when and in what exact way. And that answer was about to take its definitive shape. Consuelo Fraguas took exactly 19 days to prepare the preliminary documentation for the paternity challenge lawsuit. She informed me with a brief call to my office phone at the agency on a Monday morning in November with that efficient dryness I already recognized as her usual way of operating. She told me she needed a 2-hour meeting to review the complete draft before proceeding with the protocol. We arranged for the following Wednesday. During those 19 days, I continued doing what I had been doing for weeks, living inside that house as if nothing had fractured the interior of the walls. I got up at the same time, had breakfast across from Amparo, asked about the baby with the attention of a father slowly incorporating into a new routine. I left for the agency, came back at a reasonable hour. On weekends, we would go for walks in the Planchio Park or along the Pisuerga Promenade, when the weather permitted with the stroller and the baby between us, exactly like any mature couple who had waited a long time for this and now paraded it with discreet pride. There was a detail that Amparo repeated on several occasions during those weeks, and that I registered each time with an attention she couldn't perceive. Every time someone asked her about the baby, whether on the phone or in some casual encounter in the neighborhood, she would say that he looked like me, not in a forced or exaggerated way, but with the naturalness of someone who has rehearsed that answer until it flows effortlessly. I would nod, smile, and file the detail away in the same place I kept everything else. On Wednesday in November, I arrived at Consuelo's office with a complete briefcase. We reviewed the draft of the lawsuit for an hour and 40 minutes. Consuelo had structured the document with a precision I immediately recognized as equivalent to what I would have applied to a complex audit report. Each statement supported by its corresponding documentation, each fact chronologically placed, the genetic analysis results cited with all the details of the issuing laboratory. The paternity challenge was accompanied by a request for precautionary measures to prevent the disposal of certain assets during the course of the proceedings. I asked her how long the procedure would take to be resolved once the lawsuit was filed. She replied that it depended on the caseload of the corresponding family court, but that with the evidence we had, the investigation phase wouldn't be long, a year, perhaps less if there were no delaying appeals from the opposing party. I instructed her to prepare everything for filing, but I asked her not to file it yet. I needed to choose the moment, not out of indecision, but for the same reason an auditor doesn't sign the inspection report until the file is complete in all its pages. Filing the lawsuit before the direct confrontation would give Amparo enough reaction time to prepare her position. I wanted both things to happen with so little margin between them that there would be no room for preventive maneuvers. Consuelo looked at me for a second with an expression that wasn't exactly approval, but not disagreement either. She told me she understood and that the draft would be ready to sign the moment I decided. I left the office with the folder under my arm and made the decision about the timing as I was going down the stairs. Jacinto. I would ask Jacinto to come for dinner at our house, not as a witness in any legal sense, because the confrontation I was planning wasn't a legal act, but a conversation. And conversations don't need witnesses to be real. I needed him there for a more elementary reason, because there are moments in a man's life when it's good to have someone by your side who has known you since you were 12. Not for them to do anything, but simply to be there. I called him that same afternoon. I told him I wanted him to have dinner with us the following Friday. I didn't explain more. Jacinto asked if he should bring wine. I said yes. During the days remaining until that date, Amparo's behavior continued to be that of someone who perceives no threat in the immediate environment. That was, in a way, the most disturbing thing of all. Not because I expected her to be careless or clumsy, but because it confirmed to what extent my ability to maintain appearances had been effective. She lived within a sense of security that I had built with the same methodical care with which she had built her plan. The difference was that mine had an expiration date, and she didn't know it. On a Saturday morning, I found her in the baby's room measuring the wall with a tape measure. On the bed were several children's decoration catalogs open to pages with folded corners. She asked me if I liked the cloud-shaped shelf or the one in the shape of a little house more. I told her the cloud one. She smiled. She continued measuring. I leaned against the doorframe for a few seconds watching her. There was a very brief instant when I saw her without the weight of everything I knew. Just a 44-year-old woman measuring a wall with a tape measure in a baby's room, with her hair pulled back in a messy bun and the catalogs scattered on the bed. I was clearly aware in that specific instant that for many years that woman had been the central person in my daily life, and that didn't disappear because of what had happened later. The damage didn't erase the past. It just recontextualized it in a way that changed its meaning forever. I didn't say anything. I went to the kitchen and made breakfast. The Tuesday before the Friday dinner, I took care of the last two pending matters. The first was to transfer to an account in my exclusive name, opened at a different bank branch than usual, the amount corresponding to certain investment funds that Consuelo had identified as separate property due to their origin before the marriage. The operation was completely legal, was supported by the documentation we had prepared, and left a clean accounting trail that any expert could verify without difficulty. The second was to meet one last time with Esteban Muriel to confirm that there were no relevant developments in the surveillance of the last few weeks. He confirmed that Peinado and Amparo's movements had been ordinary, with no signs that either of them had detected anything out of the ordinary. He gave me the final bill for his services, 2,900 euros, corresponding to the remaining weeks of the assignment. I paid in cash. That night, while Amparo was sleeping, I took the tax audit book out of my briefcase for the last time. I opened a chapter on documentary fraud. I carefully extracted the phone from between the pages, as if the object had acquired a different weight from when I had stored it there weeks ago. I checked that the recording was still intact. I copied it to 2 different USB drives that I kept in separate places. Then I put the phone to charge in the outlet of the home office. I left the book on the desk, closed, with the spine facing up. Friday arrived with a dry, clean cold typical of November in Castile. I bought the wine myself in the morning, 2 bottles of a Ribera del Duero that Jacinto and I had drunk together on other occasions. I prepared dinner calmly during the afternoon. Amparo asked me if it was an anniversary she had forgotten. I told her no, that I felt like having a nice dinner at home. When Jacinto arrived at 9:15, he shook my hand in the entryway and looked me in the eyes for a second longer than usual. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The 3 of us sat at the table. I opened the first wine, served the glasses, and waited for Amparo to stop talking about the baby to take out the folder I had left on the chair on my right, out of her line of sight, since before she came down to the dining room. Amparo talked about the baby for the first 20 minutes of dinner, about the weight check on Wednesday, about the pediatrician saying the development was excellent, about how she thought he was going to have light eyes like my mother's. Jacinto listened with the polite attention of someone who doesn't have children of his own and knows that in these situations the correct role is that of a listener. I served the second glass of wine. I made a comment about the food. I asked if she wanted more bread. I waited for a natural silence, not a forced one, not a pause I created to create an effect. A silence that came on its own when Amparo finished a sentence about the decoration catalog for the room and picked up her fork to continue eating. Then I placed my cutlery on the plate carefully, wiped my mouth with a napkin, turned to the chair on my right, and took the folder. I placed it on the table in front of me, without opening it yet. Amparo looked at the folder, then at me. There was a flash in her expression of something that didn't quite become a question, a kind of instinctive alert that the body activates before the mind knows exactly what it needs to be alerted to. Jacinto put his wine glass down on the tablecloth slowly and didn't touch it again. I told Amparo that we were going to talk about something important and that I preferred we do it here at home, at the table where we had had dinner together for 23 years, calmly and without interruptions. I told her that I wasn't going to raise my voice at any point, that there was nothing in what was about to happen that required any kind of verbal violence, and that when I finished speaking, she would have all the time she needed to say whatever she wanted to say. I opened the folder. The first page I placed in front of her was the report from the Barcelona laboratory. I put it with the text facing up and slid it across the table with the same naturalness one signs an ordinary document. I gave her 3 seconds for her eyes to find the relevant paragraph. The third one, the one containing the percentage of biological compatibility written in figures that required no technical interpretation to be understood. Amparo said, "Nothing for an interval I estimated at about 15 seconds. Her eyes remained on the paper with a fixedness that wasn't one of reading, but of processing, as when the brain receives information that contradicts an assumption it believed to be unshakable. Then she looked up at me with an expression that was the first completely genuine one I had seen from her in many months. Not the rehearsed smile, not the naturalness of a woman with nothing to hide, but the face of someone who has just had the ground pulled out from under their feet without prior notice. She said that wasn't possible. She said it in a low voice, almost to herself, as if the comment were directed at the paper and not at me. I replied that the laboratory issued its certificates with a double verification protocol and that the result was definitive. The second page was the summary of Esteban Muriel's report, not the full 32-page document, but the 4-page executive summary that Muriel had prepared specifically for this moment, with the dates of the 16 documented meetings, the locations, and the complete chronology since July of 2012. I placed it on top of the first one without removing the previous one. Amparo looked at it. The color of her face had changed in a way that the light from the dining room sconces made more evident. She crossed her arms on the table, then uncrossed them, then crossed them again. She sought Jacinto's gaze. Jacinto looked at the table. She said she could explain it, not with the conviction of someone who has a real explanation, but with the automatic reflex of someone who has been trained for months to maintain an alternative version available for any contingency. I told her she could do it later when I was finished. The third piece wasn't a written document. I took the phone out of the inside pocket of my jacket, unlocked it, found the audio file, and placed it in the center of the table with the speaker facing up. I pressed play. The hospital recording filled the dining room for 1 minute and 43 seconds. The voices were clear. The heart monitor in the background was unmistakable. Amparo's voice asking if the plan was still on. Gustavo Penado's voice replying that yes, that all that was needed was for me to sign the registration, the sentence about the inheritance rights, the description of me as someone who doesn't raise suspicions. When the audio ended, the silence that remained in the dining room had a different texture from all the previous silences in that house. Amparo's eyes were moist, but she wasn't crying. Her jaw was clenched, her hands flat on the tablecloth. Now, her fingers were spread out as if she needed to feel something solid underneath. Then something in her broke in a way that wasn't dramatic, but abruptly human. A short exhalation, almost a sound without a name. And then the words that came were not a denial or a justification, but something more like a structural collapse. She said she hadn't wanted things to get to that point, that at the beginning it wasn't like that Gustavo had been the first person in years who had really seen her. I listened to her without interrupting, because what she described next, in that broken voice that no longer managed the image she presented to the world, had an internal coherence that I couldn't ignore, even though I couldn't use it as an argument in her favor either. The years of failed treatments, The feeling that I always had something more urgent to attend to, the accumulated distance and silences that neither of us had known how to break. It wasn't a justification, but it was an explanation that had roots in something real. And I knew it better than anyone, because those roots had grown partly in the territory of my own omissions. I didn't tell her that. There are things you recognize for yourself in the solitude of an office at 2 in the morning and that aren't part of any conversation with the person who used them to build a betrayal. There are different accounts that are settled in different places. I told her I understood there were reasons, that I wasn't there to discuss the reasons. That I was there to inform her that the paternity challenge lawsuit had already been prepared in all its terms and that it would be filed with the corresponding family court in the coming days by my lawyer Consuelo Fraguas Nieto. The process would run its course regardless of any conversation we might have that night or at any other time, that along with the challenge, the separation proceedings would be processed and that all the financial documentation was duly organized. The anger came then, as it usually does after the collapse and before acceptance. She told me I couldn't do that the child was innocent, that I couldn't punish a baby for the decisions of adults. I replied that she was right, that the child was innocent, that precisely for that reason the legal procedure was the right way, because it would establish with legal clarity who the biological father of that creature was and who should assume the corresponding responsibilities. That child deserved for his legal situation to reflect the biological reality and not an instrument of financial planning. There was no answer to that. Jacinto hadn't uttered a single word all night. When Amparo got up from the table without finishing her dinner and went to the bedroom, he looked at me with that expression that only people who have been your friends for 4 decades have. Without pity, without triumph, just with the quiet presence of someone who has witnessed something that should never have needed witnesses. I served him the rest of the wine that was left in the bottle. We cleared the table in silence. Jacinto left shortly before midnight. In the entryway, he put a hand on my shoulder for a second without saying anything. I closed the door. I sat on the living room sofa with the lights on, listening to the silence of the apartment, which was a different silence from all the previous nights. No sound came from the bedroom. Just the baby, who moved briefly at some point and then was still again. The next day, I called Consuelo Fraguas first thing. I told her to file the lawsuit. Legal proceedings have their own time, and that time is neither negotiated nor accelerated by the urgency of the one who initiates them. I learned this during the months that followed that November dinner, in the same way you learn things that are not taught in any manual, by absorbing them slowly with the obligatory patience of someone who has no other option but to wait for the process to run its course. Amparo left the apartment 3 weeks after the dinner. She took the baby, her clothes, the decoration catalogs that were still stacked on the small table in the room. There was no farewell conversation. On a Tuesday morning, when I returned from the agency at noon, the house was silent in a way different from all previous silences, different even from the silence of that night on the sofa. It was the silence of spaces that have been emptied of human presence permanently, and that one recognizes immediately because it's unlike any other. She moved in with her sister in Salamanca. Gustavo Peinado, as Muriel informed me in a final follow-up I commissioned as a precaution, continued to practice at the clinic on Paseo de Zorrilla for the first few months, until the investigation of the legal proceedings began to produce the first collateral effects on his professional environment. Legal proceedings in which a doctor's name appears related to a paternity challenge don't remain invisible in small clinical settings. That wasn't a consequence I designed. It was simply what happens when facts take their legal form and cease to be the secrets of 2 people to become public documents. The paternity challenge judgment was issued 11 months after the complaint was filed. The family court number 3 of Valladolid determined, based on the report from the Barcelona laboratory and the expert genetic evidence ordered by the court itself, which confirmed the same results with an identical conclusion, that I was not the biological father of the creature provisionally registered under the Salcedo surname. The resolution ordered the rectification of the birth certificate. The child would be registered only with his mother's surnames until the corresponding paternal affiliation was judicially determined, a process that concerned Amparo and Gustavo Peinado, in a separate proceeding that was not within my purview. Consuelo Fraguas called me to communicate the resolution with the same sobriety with which she had explained the steps of the process at the beginning. She told me it was a clean result, that there were no flaws in the file, that if Amparo decided to appeal the appeal process, she would have very little room given the weight of the evidence. She didn't appeal. The divorce was processed in parallel and became final 4 months after the challenge judgment. The settlement of the community property accurately reflected what the financial documentation proved. The assets acquired with separate funds prior to the marriage were excluded from the divisible assets. What was to be divided was divided in the terms established by law. Not a euro more, not a euro less. There was no strategic generosity, nor any calculated meanness. There was a precise application of what was due, which was the only thing the situation deserved. The total fees between Consuelo Fraguas, Esteban Muriel, and the laboratory analyses amounted to 16,400 euros. I paid them without resentment. They are the cost of recovering what is yours when someone has decided they have the right to take it. What no one had explained to me, and what is also not in any legal procedure manual, is how you live your daily life during the time that all of this is being resolved. Legal proceedings have hearings, deadlines, and notifications that give structure to time. But between one hearing and the next, there are ordinary days when you get up, make coffee, go to work, eat, come back, have dinner alone, and go to bed. Days when the apartment has a silence that is no longer one of waiting, but a permanent condition. Days when you sit at the desk in your home office and look at the wall and don't think about anything in particular because your brain has exhausted its capacity to process what it has already processed 1,000 times. I don't regret any decision I made throughout that process. I say that with the honesty of someone who has had enough time to review everything from multiple angles. I acted according to what the situation required, with the legal means available, and without crossing any line that shouldn't be crossed. If I were back in that hospital hallway with the phone in my hand, I would press the record button again. What I do recognize, and I think it would be dishonest not to recognize it, is that a part of what happened has roots in years when I wasn't present in the way I should have been, not as a justification for what she chose to do, which was her decision and hers alone, but as the part of the story that belongs to me and that I can't blame on anyone else. I worked too much for too many years. I assumed too many things instead of asking. I confused material stability with real presence. Those are mistakes I made and that I recognize without drama, but also without evading them. The lesson I draw from all this, if you can call something that cost 23 years and everything it costs a lesson, is simple and has the clarity of things that are only seen from a certain distance. Loyalty is not inferred from shared time. It's not given by the accumulation of years or by contracts signed before a judge. It's sustained or not sustained by the decisions each person makes when no one is watching. And when someone decides that the decisions they will make when they're not being watched will go in another direction, the only thing left is to have enough clarity to see it and the necessary determination to act accordingly. That child is now over a year old. I don't know how he is. It's not cruel indifference, but the honest recognition that it's not my place to know. His life will be built by those who are responsible for him. I'm not. I will not be. And that is the direct and permanent consequence of a plan that was hatched on the day that should have been the clearest of my life. I don't say this with satisfaction or with bitterness. I say it as someone describing a fact that has its own irreversible logic. Jacinto called me the day I received the notification of the final divorce decree. He asked me how I was. I told him I was fine, that I was calm. He told me that one day we would have to open a bottle of that Ribera del Duero that was left over from the November dinner. I said yes, that any day. That bottle is still in the kitchen cupboard. I see it every morning when I open the door for coffee. A few weeks ago, I organized the desk in my home office. There were papers piled up from the months of the process, folders that no longer needed to be at hand, documents that could be filed away permanently. In the midst of all that was the Tax Audit Procedures Manual, revised 2009 edition. I took it, opened it to the chapter on documentary fraud, the section where I had kept the phone for weeks that now seemed distant and at the same time completely sharp. The pages were slightly deformed by the weight of the phone store between them for so long. I ran my finger over the hollow it had left, that small rectangular depression in the paper that wouldn't disappear, even if the book were closed 1,000 more times. I placed it on the desk. I left it there. There are things that aren't filed away. There are things you leave in sight, not to constantly remember them, but to not pretend they didn't happen. That book is now both the most ordinary object in my office and the only silent witness of the weeks when I learned that a lifetime of experience doesn't serve to prevent you from being deceived, but it does serve when the time comes so that you are not deceived twice.